I have two images open inside of Adobe Camera Raw. Both have problems with contrast. In this image we have an image captured where the subject brightness range was extremely high, giving problems with very dark shadows and overly bright highlights. Okay, now typically we would start in the basic panel and start with a top-down approach. Okay, using the exposure and white balance sliders first, but because the image is so compromised, we're going to have to choose a slightly different approach to this image. Before I get start tackling the shadows and the highlights, I'm just going to zoom in around this area of the rocks here, looking at this high contrast area. And as I suspected, we've got a good deal of problem with chromatic aberration inside of this image. So before I do any of the basic adjustments, I'm just going to come over to the lens corrections panel, and we can choose the enable lens profiles. Unfortunately, there isn't a profile for this Carl Zeiss lens on this Sony camera, so we're going to just have to pass this one by. You could try and pick up a profile by going to labs.adobe.com and looking for the profile downloader to try and find additional profiles that might not be installed inside of Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to move along, however, to the Color tab and choose the Remove Chromatic Aberration, and that deals with that problem very nicely indeed. I'm now going to Fit in View, Command 0 on a Mac or Control 0 on a PC, and now we'll set about trying to tackle the shadows and highlights inside of this image. I'm going to grab the highlight slider and try and bring a good deal of that richness back into the sky. Maybe I'll pull that all the way down to -100 for maximum detail in that sky. And now I'm going to open up the shadows. Okay, if I pull it over to +100, we've probably got too much detail there, so I'm just going to back that up maybe to around +70 for a nice balance between the shadows and the highlights. Okay, we probably need to add in a little bit of contrast. It's starting to look a little bit flat, bringing down the highlights and opening up the shadows, so I'm going to put a little bit of contrast back in, maybe around about 30 to 40 would give us that sort of drama that we're probably looking for. I'm also suspecting that this is slightly warm in the rocks here, so I'm just going to adjust the color temperature now, probably down to around about 4800. Should give me a nice look. Slightly cooler rocks but still warm sky there, and I'll just zero the tint slider to 0 there. Okay, we can give a little bit more localized definition to these rocks by raising the clarity. I'm going to push that up to around about 35 to increase the drama in those rocks there. And because this is a sunset and we can probably give a lot richer colors here, I'm going to push that vibrant slider up to around 50 or so, so we get some really nice dramatic colors going on now. I can add a little bit of drama to the sky by bringing the blues down in that sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the HSL tab, and I've got the luminance section here, and I'm going to grab that blues and pull it down just so we've got a little bit more definition between the clouds and that blue sky now. The sky could come down a little bit more by using a graduated filter. We could just select the graduated filter there. I'll click on the minus exposure. Okay, I'll just zero that out, just double click to 0 and then click once again for a -half stop adjustment there, and then click and drag down over the sky to create a much more dramatic sky than we had before. That's probably a little bit too intense. We could wind that back perhaps to 1/3 of a stop or so. Okay, now that I've made all of those adjustments, I'll just return to the basic panel. Okay, I'm just clicking on the zoom tool to exit the graduated filter, and then click on the basic icon there. It's getting a little bit dark, so I'm just going to now add half a stop. As I said at the beginning of this tutorial, sometimes you are encouraged as this is the first slider, and it's almost now the last slider that we're applying into this adjustment. Perhaps just a little bit more there. Okay, half a stop extra. Okay, once we've opened up shadows to that extent, it's quite likely that we're going to have issues with noise inside of those shadows. So I'm going to zoom into actual pixels, Command Option 0 on a Mac or Control Alt 0 on a PC, just to zoom in. And as I suspected, we've got some noise issues going on inside of this file, but we can handle those quite nicely just by coming over to the Detail tab, and I'll raise the luminance slider. Okay, we're not trying to remove all of that noise, just try and suppress it. Perhaps around about 30 would suffice. If we're losing a little bit of detail in the rocks, then we can raise the luminance detail just to push in a little bit of extra detail back into those rocks that we might lose by excessive noise reduction. Okay, and also what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharpening these rocks probably a little bit further. Okay, let's just pull down to an area which I'd like to look at the sharpening. We're at 100%, which is always important when we're sharpening these files, and I'm just going to push that amount slider up to around about 50. This will give us some nice crisp rocks, but will also push or raise the noise levels in those smoother areas again, and this we can control using the masking slider. Just hold down the Alt or Option key and then drag that to the right, and all of the black areas now will be protected from that sharpening process. So we're really only sharpening the edges now, so we're getting nice noise reduction plus also sharpening into that process. Okay, I'll just fit on screen again, Command 0 or Control 0 on a Mac, and now I'm going to add in a vignette to complete this image. Okay, so we're going to come up to the FX panel, and I'll choose the amount slider and pull that down over the corners, maybe -30 to pull in that vignette. Now often in highlight priority style we can invoke quite a lot of clipping, and so sometimes that can be improved by just choosing the color priority option instead, and as you can see that luminance clipping has pretty much disappeared there now. And just a little bit of saturation clipping at both ends. I'm not really too worried about the clipping in the highlights, that is just around the sun there. Okay, if the color is clipping probably just a little bit excessively, we could just lower the saturation of those yellows or oranges just a fraction to pull in the saturation clipping in those areas, like so. Okay, so that comes back into the color gamut now, and I think I'll handle the clipping down here in the shadows just by adjusting that black slider, moving that over to the right slightly. So now we have a very detail rich image that probably resembles more to how I actually remember shooting this scene than how the camera actually captured it. As we saw before, let's just go and have a look at it before and after here. Camera raw defaults. Okay, that's not what I saw, and we'll just Command Z to go back to the edited version, which just shows you the ability of Adobe Camera Raw to restore what we actually saw in an image rather than what the sensor recorded. We have a similar sort of problem with this second image that I have here. This image was shot in Death Valley with a telephoto lens, and obviously the amount of UV light and dust in the atmosphere has really lowered the contrast really significantly. We can see the histogram here occupies probably no more than a quarter of the dynamic range from black on the left to white on the right. Even pulling the contrast over to maximum plus 100 adds a little bit, but doesn't really significantly rectify this file. I can pull the exposure down, and we're getting a little bit more drama now, but not nearly enough. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to drag that black slider over to the left hand side in order to reconnect a black point with this image. Okay, and we can also do the same thing with the white slider, pulling that over to the right hand side to connect a white point to this image. Okay, it's probably a little bit cool in color temperature, so I'm just going to warm this up. Okay, and we're also going to add a little bit of clarity for localized contrast there. I'm just going to take that exposure down a little bit too further, because it's probably still a little bit too bright, so take that down like so. And let's push up the vibrance of the colors, so we get some nice rich colors going on there, and maybe pull that color temperature up a little bit more. Okay, so as we can see now, we're restoring full drama to this image. If you're still looking for extra contrast, but we've run out of contrast adjustment as it's set to +100, it's probably a good excuse to now to come into the tone curve panel, and at the moment it's set as linear, but we could choose one of the options here, such as strong contrast, which boosts that contrast even further. Okay, so quite quickly you can see how we can take an image from its default values. Let's just do a before and after again. Choose camera raw defaults. Ooh, very low contrast, and Command Z in order to bring back the full drama inside of this image.